On the afternoon of June 4, 1942, Adolf Hitler crossed into Finland for the only official visit he would ever make to the country. Europe was in flames. German armies were deep inside the Soviet Union. The outcome of the war was still uncertain, but Germany appeared powerful, advancing across the continent with speed and confidence. The visit was presented as a courtesy, a birthday greeting, a gesture of respect to Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim on his 75th birthday. But it was not courtesy that brought Hitler north. It was necessity. Finland had been fighting the Soviet Union for nearly a year in what became known as the Continuation War. Officially, Finland was not a formal member of the Axis alliance. There was no binding treaty tying Helsinki to Berlin. The arrangement was deliberate and carefully constructed. Finland fought the same enemy as Germany, but it did not fight under German command. Mannerheim had insisted on that distinction. By 1942, Germany expected loyalty from those who stood beside it. Its armies had swept through the Baltic states. It had encircled Leningrad. It had pushed toward Moscow the previous winter. Finland had regained much of the territory lost in the Winter War of 1939. The front lines had stabilized. The fighting in the north was no longer desperate defense. It had become positional. Hitler wanted more. He wanted Finland to commit fully. He wanted increased pressure on Leningrad from the north. He wanted certainty that Finland would remain aligned no matter how the war developed. Above all, he wanted reassurance that Germany's northern partner would not seek a separate path. Mannerheim had different priorities. He had served in the Imperial Russian Army before 1917. He had watched the Russian Empire collapse. He had witnessed Germany's defeat in 1918. He understood that great powers often appear invincible until they are not. He knew that wars of momentum can become wars of attrition with devastating speed. The meeting would take place not in Helsinki, not in a ceremonial hall, but in a railway carriage near the airfield at Immola. The setting was controlled and modest. Finnish authorities had been cautious. They did not want spectacle. They did not want photographs that suggested subordination. The encounter would be contained. Hitler arrived tense. Observers later described him as restrained, almost subdued. There was no grand public speech, no dramatic gestures. The formal birthday celebration was brief. The essential conversation happened privately, inside the train. What Mannerheim heard there would matter far more than any official statement. The discussion lasted roughly 2 hours. There were no official transcripts intended for public release, yet Finnish intelligence made a quiet decision. A recording device was concealed inside the carriage. It would capture approximately 11 minutes of conversation before being noticed and turned off. Those 11 minutes remain the only known recording of Hitler speaking in a private, informal setting. The voice preserved on the tape is not theatrical. It is not explosive. It is measured, analytical, at times almost reflective. Hitler speaks about the Soviet Union. He admits surprise. He describes the scale of Soviet industrial production. He talks about factories relocated beyond the Ural Mountains. He speaks about encountering far more tanks than German planners had anticipated. He acknowledges that Germany had underestimated the depth of Soviet resources. This was not the language of easy victory. For Mannerheim, who had studied Russian logistics and military culture for decades, the implications were unmistakable. If Germany had misjudged the Soviet Union's capacity, then the war in the East would not be brief. It would not be decided in a single sweeping campaign. It would become a prolonged struggle. A prolonged struggle favored the side with greater reserves. Finland did not possess vast reserves. Germany's were not limitless either. Mannerheim listened carefully. He did not interrupt. He did not challenge. He did not reveal agreement or doubt. His discipline was absolute. Emotion rarely appeared on his face. Those who knew him understood that silence did not mean passivity. It meant calculation. Tone often reveals more than content. In public, Hitler projected certainty and inevitability. In private, he spoke of obstacles, of numbers, of production, of strategic concerns that suggested the war was more complex than promised. By mid-1942, Germany had not yet suffered the catastrophe of Stalingrad. Its armies still held vast territory. To outside observers, the Reich looked dominant. But inside that railway carriage, Hitler acknowledged limits. He spoke of oil from Romania, of the necessity of securing resources, of cutting Soviet supply lines. His analysis was detailed and technical. He was not delivering propaganda. He was thinking aloud. That detail mattered. In moments of confidence, leaders simplify. In moments of strain, they explain. For Mannerheim, the explanation was revealing. He had always approached Germany with caution. Finland's alignment in 1941 had been born from necessity, not ideology. When the Soviet Union attacked Finland in November 1939, Western support had been distant and largely symbolic. Germany had been bound by its pact with Moscow and had offered no assistance. Finland had fought alone in the Winter War. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the strategic landscape changed. Finland saw an opportunity to recover lost territory and secure its borders. It did not seek conquest beyond limited aims. Mannerheim was clear that Finnish forces would not advance recklessly or embrace ideological crusades. Germany sought decisive destruction of the Soviet state. Finland sought security. Inside the train on June 4, 1942, that difference sharpened. If Hitler himself was uncertain about the speed of victory, then Germany's timetable was fragile. If the war dragged into years rather than months, Finland would eventually face a choice: remain tied to a weakening Germany or find a way to disengage before collapse arrived. Mannerheim could not signal doubt. He could not appear distant. Finland depended on German supplies and coordination, yet he could prepare quietly. The recording device was eventually discovered. A German aide noticed the wire. The Finnish officer responsible apologized and explained that the device was meant for archival purposes. Hitler's entourage insisted that it be switched off. The tension did not escalate. The moment passed, but the brief recording survived. It remains one of the most revealing artifacts of the war in Northern Europe, not because of dramatic declarations, but because of tone. After the private conversation ended, the formalities concluded quickly. Hitler departed Finland the same day. No sweeping agreements were announced. No visible shift occurred at the front. On the surface, nothing had changed. Finland remained aligned with Germany against the Soviet Union. Military cooperation continued. The lines held. But strategy is rarely altered by public ceremony. It shifts in private, in silence, in the space between words. On that train, Mannerheim heard the leader of Europe's most formidable military machine acknowledge miscalculation. He heard awareness of limits. He heard concern about resources and time. And time was everything. If Germany required time it did not have, then Finland required patience it could sustain. The realization was not dramatic. It did not produce visible reaction. Mannerheim did not leave the train with anger or alarm. He left with information. Empires that underestimate their enemies often discover the cost too late. Mannerheim had seen one empire collapse in 1917. He understood how quickly certainty can dissolve. From that afternoon onward, Finland's war would continue, but its horizon would widen. The objective would no longer be tied solely to German success. It would be tied to survival. And survival required preparation for the possibility that Germany might not win. In the weeks after June 4, 1942, nothing appeared different along the front. Finnish and German forces continued their coordinated operations in the north. Supplies moved along established routes. Officers exchanged reports. Publicly, the alliance looked stable, but strategy in Helsinki was never built on appearances. Mannerheim did not need to announce a change. He simply adjusted emphasis. The war would be fought, but not expanded. Commitments would be honored, but not deepened. Every decision would be measured against a single question: what happens if Germany does not win? By the summer of 1942, the Eastern Front stretched thousands of kilometers. German forces were pushing toward the Volga and the oil fields of the Caucasus. Operation Blue had begun. To many observers, it seemed like another unstoppable surge. Yet from a military perspective, the scale of the campaign was risky. Supply lines grew longer. Fuel consumption increased. The German army was operating at the limits of its logistical capacity. Mannerheim understood logistics. He had spent decades studying them. Armies are not defeated only by enemy fire. They are defeated by distance, weather, fuel shortages, and industrial imbalance. On the train, Hitler had spoken at length about oil and production. That alone was revealing. A leader confident in imminent victory does not dwell on shortages. Finland's leadership began to consider the war not as a single arc, but as phases. Phase 1 had been recovery of lost territory. Phase 2 was stabilization. Phase 3, though not openly defined, would require flexibility. One of the clearest signals of restraint was Finland's refusal to attack Leningrad directly. German planners wanted pressure from the north. They hoped Finnish forces would join in a decisive assault that would help break the city. Leningrad was symbolically and strategically significant. Its fall would have been a dramatic blow to the Soviet Union. Mannerheim declined. Finnish forces halted along defensive lines north of the city. They did not advance further. Officially, the explanation was military prudence. In reality, it was political calculation. A direct role in the destruction of Leningrad would bind Finland permanently to Germany's fate. Mannerheim understood optics. He understood post-war consequences, even in the middle of war. If Germany succeeded, Finland would be secure. If Germany failed, Finland needed distance. The train conversation reinforced that distance. It did not cause it, but it clarified it. Through late 1942, reports from the front grew more complex. German advances slowed. Resistance stiffened. Casualties mounted. In November 1942, the Soviet counteroffensive at Stalingrad encircled the German Sixth Army. News of the encirclement reached Finland quickly. For Mannerheim, Stalingrad was not merely a battle, it was a signal. The kind of signal he had anticipated months earlier inside that railway carriage. If Germany could lose an entire army, then the myth of invincibility was broken. Publicly, Finland remained committed. Privately, contingency planning intensified. Diplomatic channels that had never fully closed remained open. Contacts with Sweden continued. Quiet assessments of Western intentions were made. Finland's leadership began to explore, cautiously, the idea of a separate peace. Though no immediate move was possible, Germany still occupied large areas of northern Finland. German troops were present. Supplies flowed from German stockpiles. Any abrupt shift would have been dangerous. Mannerheim's approach was patient. He had learned during the collapse of the Russian Empire that sudden movements can destroy fragile states. Timing mattered more than impulse. In early 1943, after the German defeat at Stalingrad became undeniable, pressure increased from Berlin. Germany demanded firmer commitment from its partners. Loyalty was questioned. Expectations hardened. Finland resisted additional obligations. Requests for broader offensive operations were met with caution. Political leaders in Helsinki framed decisions as defensive necessities. They avoided ideological language. They emphasized national interest. Mannerheim's realization on June 4, 1942, was not that Germany would certainly lose. It was that Germany could lose. That distinction shaped everything. If defeat was possible, then Finland's survival depended on maneuverability. Throughout 1943, the war shifted. The Red Army began to regain territory steadily. German forces retreated from the Caucasus. The front moved westward. The initiative passed to Moscow. Each shift confirmed what had been hinted at in Hitler's private tone. The Soviet Union was not collapsing, it was adapting. Finland's intelligence assessments grew sharper. Reports emphasized Soviet production increases. Tank output rose dramatically. Aircraft numbers expanded. Manpower reserves remained vast. The war was becoming what Hitler had quietly feared. A struggle of resources. Finland could not win a resource war against the Soviet Union alone. It had barely survived one in 1939. Its survival in 1944 would require not just military skill, but political timing. Mannerheim maintained strict discipline within the Finnish command structure. There would be no reckless offensives, no symbolic gestures that might entangle Finland further. The army conserved strength. Defensive fortifications were improved. At the same time, relations with Germany were managed carefully. Public statements remained respectful. Military cooperation continued where necessary. There was no open break. The art of survival lay in ambiguity. Germany needed Finland's northern front to remain stable. Finland needed German supplies. Neither side fully trusted the other, but both required the arrangement to continue. Inside this fragile balance, the memory of that train conversation lingered. Hitler had spoken of industrial depth beyond the Urals. He had acknowledged that German intelligence had underestimated Soviet capacity. He had described a war more complex than expected. These were not confessions of defeat. They were admissions of difficulty. For Mannerheim, difficulty was enough. By 1944, the consequences of Germany's overstretch became unavoidable. The Red Army launched massive offensives across the Eastern Front. In June 1944, Soviet forces began a powerful assault against Finnish positions on the Karelian Isthmus. The scale was immense. Artillery barrages shook the front lines. Soviet divisions pushed hard, seeking to break through and force Finland out of the war by force. This was the moment Finland had prepared for. If Germany could not stop the Soviet advance in the south, Finland would have to stabilize its own front alone. The battles of Tali and Ihantala in the summer of 1944 became decisive. Finnish forces, using concentrated artillery and defensive coordination, halted the Soviet advance. The front held. But the message was clear. The Soviet Union retained enormous capacity to attack. Finland's margin for error was gone. The time for maneuver had arrived. In August 1944, Mannerheim became president of Finland. The transition allowed political flexibility. Soon after, negotiations for an armistice with the Soviet Union accelerated. Germany protested. It expected continued loyalty, but the strategic logic had shifted irreversibly. The realization that Germany might not win, first reinforced on that quiet afternoon in June 1942, had matured into action. Finland signed an armistice with the Soviet Union in September 1944. The price was heavy. Territory was ceded. Reparations were imposed. German forces in northern Finland had to be expelled, leading to the Lapland War. Yet Finland remained independent. It was not occupied. It was not absorbed into the Soviet Union. Survival had required restraint. It had required patience. It had required listening carefully, even to an ally. On June 4, 1942, inside a railway carriage at Immola, Mannerheim did not confront Hitler. He did not argue. He did not declare doubt. He listened. And in the measured tone of a leader explaining unexpected resistance, he heard what others did not. He heard the possibility of failure. For a small nation between great powers, recognizing possibility is often the difference between destruction and survival. The meeting on June 4, 1942, was not only a strategic moment, it was a collision of temperaments. Adolf Hitler built his power on certainty. His authority depended on momentum, belief, and the projection of inevitability. He spoke in absolutes. He framed wars as destiny. His rise had been powered by risk, by speed, by audacity. Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim was the opposite. He did not believe in destiny. He believed in margins, in preparation, in endurance. His authority came not from spectacle, but from restraint. He rarely raised his voice. He rarely revealed emotion. His leadership style was quiet, almost detached. The contrast mattered. Inside that railway carriage, Hitler talked. He analyzed. He justified. He explained how the Soviet Union had surprised him with its production capacity. He spoke of factories dismantled and rebuilt beyond the Urals. He emphasized numbers, tanks, oil, manpower. Mannerheim absorbed it all without interruption. For Hitler, the war against the Soviet Union was ideological and existential. For Mannerheim, it was geographical and practical. Finland's goals were limited. Secure borders, prevent future invasion, preserve sovereignty. Hitler aimed to reshape Europe. Mannerheim aimed to preserve Finland. When Hitler described the scale of Soviet industry, he was confronting a reality that challenged his assumptions. The Soviet Union had not collapsed under the initial assault. It had relocated industry eastward. It had mobilized manpower at staggering levels. It had absorbed losses that would have crippled other nations. Hitler had expected a rapid victory in 1941. By mid-1942, that expectation had dissolved. Mannerheim recognized the pattern. He had seen Russian resilience before. During the First World War, Imperial Russia had suffered catastrophic defeats, yet continued fighting. In the Winter War of 1939, the Soviet Union had absorbed humiliation and heavy losses, but eventually forced concessions through sheer weight. Russia, in its imperial or Soviet form, did not collapse easily under pressure. Germany, by contrast, had limited room for error. Its economy was strong but smaller. Its resources were constrained. Its war machine depended on speed. If speed failed, strain followed. That was the unspoken conclusion of the train conversation. Mannerheim's background shaped his interpretation. Born in 1867, he had lived through multiple European transformations. He had served the Tsar for decades. He had ridden across Central Asia as a cavalry officer. He had witnessed revolution in 1917 and the collapse of an empire that once seemed permanent. He did not assume permanence. Hitler, by 1942, was 53 years old and had built a state around personal authority. His legitimacy depended on continued victory. His strategic decisions increasingly reflected urgency. Mannerheim could afford patience. The psychological gap between them widened as the war progressed. After Stalingrad in early 1943, Germany's aura of inevitability was shattered. Even within Germany, confidence wavered. Allied bombing intensified. The Eastern Front consumed divisions at an unsustainable rate. Finland watched closely. Mannerheim did not rush toward separation. He understood the danger of premature action. German forces were stationed in Lapland. A sudden break in 1943 could have triggered immediate confrontation. Instead, he waited. He strengthened defensive lines. He maintained formal cooperation while avoiding deeper integration. He preserved diplomatic channels to Stockholm and through Sweden to the Western Allies. His approach reflected a fundamental difference in worldview. Hitler sought decisive, transformative moments. He believed in turning points achieved through bold action. Mannerheim believed in endurance, in surviving long enough for larger forces to exhaust themselves. The train conversation symbolized that divide. Hitler's admission of surprise at Soviet industrial capacity revealed vulnerability. It suggested that his strategic framework had blind spots. Mannerheim's silence concealed analysis. As 1943 progressed, the Red Army launched offensives that pushed German forces westward. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 marked another decisive failure for German initiative. After Kursk, Germany was largely on the defensive in the east. Each setback confirmed the trajectory Mannerheim had begun preparing for. Finland's leadership debated options carefully. Peace feelers were explored discreetly. The Soviet Union demanded harsh terms, including significant territorial concessions and reparations. Negotiations stalled repeatedly. Trust was minimal on both sides. Yet the idea of eventual separation from Germany was no longer abstract. In June 1944, the Soviet summer offensive tested Finland's military strength directly. The bombardment on the Karelian Isthmus was overwhelming. Soviet divisions advanced with force. Cities were threatened. The situation resembled the darkest days of 1939. Germany provided some assistance, including weapons and air support, but its ability to project sustained power was limited. Its own fronts were collapsing under Allied pressure in the west and Soviet pressure in the east. Finland fought intensely at Tali and Ihantala. Concentrated artillery coordination and defensive tactics halted the Soviet advance. The line stabilized. This stabilization created space. Space to negotiate, space to choose. By August 1944, the logic that began crystallizing in 1942 reached its conclusion. President Risto Ryti resigned to facilitate diplomatic maneuvering. Mannerheim assumed the presidency, combining military authority with political leadership. Soon after, Finland sought an armistice with Moscow. The decision was not sudden. It was the product of 2 years of quiet adjustment. On the train in 1942, Mannerheim had recognized that Germany's victory was uncertain. In 1944, that uncertainty became reality. Finland signed the Moscow Armistice on September 19, 1944. The terms were harsh, borders were redrawn, reparations were heavy. Finland was required to expel German forces from its territory, leading to the Lapland War. Northern towns were burned as German troops retreated, yet Finland remained sovereign. It did not become a satellite state. It did not lose its political system. It retained its army, its parliament, its institutions. This outcome was not guaranteed in 1942. It required preparation long before separation was possible. The train conversation did not create Finland's strategy. It clarified its urgency. For a small nation positioned between two aggressive powers, the difference between destruction and survival often lies in perception, recognizing shifts before they become obvious, listening for hesitation in an ally's voice, detecting strain beneath rhetoric. On June 4, 1942, Hitler spoke candidly about unexpected resistance and industrial depth. He did not know he was being recorded. He did not know that his tone would be preserved. He likely did not consider how his words might be interpreted. Mannerheim did. He did not need dramatic revelations. He needed confirmation that his caution was justified. The rest of the war unfolded in ways that validated that caution. Germany's defeat became inevitable by early 1945. Berlin fell in May. The Reich that had dominated Europe for a brief period collapsed completely. Finland, though scarred and burdened, endured. The difference was not size or strength, it was calculation. Hitler believed in reshaping history through force. Mannerheim believed in surviving history through restraint. Inside that railway carriage at Immola, those two philosophies met briefly. One spoke of ambition constrained by unexpected reality. The other listened and quietly adjusted course. The moment did not change the war immediately. It changed Finland's preparation for its end, and in the quiet arithmetic of survival, that was enough. There is something striking about the recording from June 4, 1942. It is not dramatic. It does not sound like history turning. There are no raised voices, no declarations, no threats. Just a man speaking carefully about industrial output and oil. That is what makes it powerful. For decades, Hitler had built authority through theatrical certainty. Public speeches were filled with conviction. His language was absolute. Victory was inevitable. Enemies were inferior. Destiny was assured. But on that train, the tone is different. He is explaining why the Soviet Union had not collapsed, explaining how German planners had misjudged production, explaining the scale of the challenge. It is the tone of a leader confronting limits. Mannerheim understood limits better than most. He had commanded cavalry across vast territories. He had seen soldiers freeze in snow and starve in retreat. He had watched governments fall. He had watched crowds cheer leaders who would later disappear. He did not mistake momentum for permanence. That difference in temperament defined Finland's survival. For Germany, the war in the East was meant to be decisive, a swift campaign that would break Soviet resistance and reshape the continent. When speed failed, Germany had few alternatives. For Finland, the war was always conditional. It had clear boundaries, it had clear objectives: recover lost territory, secure defensible lines, avoid ideological entanglement. The train meeting exposed how differently the two leaders viewed risk. Hitler believed pressure would eventually produce collapse. Mannerheim believed pressure often produced resistance. When Hitler spoke of unexpected Soviet tank numbers and relocated factories, he was acknowledging that pressure had produced adaptation. The Soviet state had not shattered, it had reorganized. That was the warning. In 1942, it was still possible to imagine a German recovery. Stalingrad had not yet fallen, Allied armies had not yet landed in Normandy. The global balance was uncertain. But Mannerheim was not listening for headlines. He was listening for tone. A small nation cannot afford optimism based on headlines. It must calculate based on probability. Probability was shifting. The following 2 years would prove it. Stalingrad, Kursk, the Allied landings in Italy, the opening of a second front in the West in June 1944. Each event narrowed Germany's options. Finland's window for maneuver narrowed as well. When the Soviet summer offensive began in June 1944, it was the test Mannerheim had anticipated. If Finland's army collapsed, independence would vanish regardless of German success or failure elsewhere. But the army held. The defensive victory at Tali and Ihantala was not glamorous. It was not a sweeping counterattack. It was containment. Precision, concentrated artillery fire, coordination under pressure. It was exactly the kind of disciplined response Mannerheim valued. Hold long enough, create space, then choose. The armistice in September 1944 was not a triumph. It was a compromise forced by reality. Finland lost territory permanently. It paid reparations. It fought former German allies in Lapland, but it remained independent. That independence did not emerge suddenly in 1944. It was preserved through decisions made earlier, through restraint in 1941, through caution in 1942, through quiet preparation in 1943, and perhaps through recognition on a quiet afternoon inside a railway carriage. History often celebrates battles and declarations. It rarely highlights moments of listening, yet listening can alter the trajectory of a nation. On June 4, 1942, Hitler spoke candidly about industrial surprise and strategic difficulty. He did not intend to reveal weakness, he intended to analyze. But analysis reveals uncertainty. Mannerheim heard it. He did not respond with confrontation. He did not challenge Germany publicly. He did not signal doubt to his own troops. He absorbed the information and adjusted slowly. That adjustment is what separated Finland from many other small states caught between empires. Some tied themselves completely to one power and fell when that power fell. Finland maintained ambiguity long enough to step away before collapse. The train at Immola was not a battlefield. It was not a signing ceremony. It was not the site of a treaty. It was a conversation. But within that conversation lay the acknowledgement that the war would not be short, that the Soviet Union was stronger than expected, that the future was uncertain. For a leader like Mannerheim, uncertainty was not frightening. It was clarifying. It meant prepare for every outcome. When Hitler left Finland that evening, he likely believed the visit had secured loyalty. Finland remained in the war. Cooperation continued. Nothing dramatic had shifted. He could not hear what Mannerheim heard. He could not see that in the silence across the table, calculations were already unfolding. 2 years later, Germany would be collapsing on all fronts. Berlin would fall. The Reich would cease to exist. Finland would endure, scarred, smaller, financially burdened, but sovereign. The difference was not strength, it was judgment. On that train, one leader was explaining why victory was harder than expected. The other was measuring how long he could wait before choosing survival over alignment. History remembers speeches, but sometimes survival begins with listening. And on June 4, 1942, in a quiet railway carriage in Finland, listening changed the course of a nation.